A magnitude 9 earthquake triggered an automatic reactor shutdown at Fukushima Daiichi Unit 1, a 40-year-old boiling water reactor. Emergency diesel generators started as designed. Operators followed emergency procedures. Critical safety systems activated automatically. Yet within 24 hours the reactor core would suffer complete meltdown. Not because procedures failed, but because the emergency response framework assumed a condition that no longer existed: electrical power for active cooling systems. This analysis examines how a station blackout scenario, considered so unlikely it required no specific procedures, exposed fundamental gaps between design assumptions and physical reality. At 1446 JST, on March 11, 2011, Fukushima Daiichi Unit 1, a Mark I boiling water reactor, automatically shut down following seismic signals from a magnitude 9 earthquake. Control rods inserted successfully. Reactor pressure stabilized at 7 MPa. Emergency diesel generators started within 40 seconds, powering critical cooling systems exactly as designed. For 41 minutes, the emergency response proceeded according to 4 decades of training and procedure development. Then the tsunami arrived. When seawater overwhelmed the emergency diesel generators at 1527, operators faced a condition that existed at the margins of design consideration: station blackout. No electrical power meant no pumps, no instrumentation, no active cooling. The reactor's residual heat, still generating megawatts of thermal energy, could only be removed through passive systems never intended for extended operation. Operators followed the procedures they had. They opened relief valves manually. They attempted to restore power. They prepared for water injection using fire trucks and portable pumps. Every action was logical, trained, and insufficient. The emergency response framework assumed that electrical power, if lost, would be rapidly restored. It assumed that cooling could be interrupted briefly, not indefinitely. The core began melting not because operators failed, but because the entire safety philosophy presumed a world where backup power meant backup power. At 1446 JST, on March 11, 2011, Fukushima Daiichi Unit 1, a 40-year-old boiling water reactor, automatically shut down following seismic signals from a magnitude 9 earthquake. Control rods inserted successfully. Reactor pressure stabilized at 7 MPa. Emergency diesel generators started within 40 seconds, powering critical cooling systems exactly as designed. For 41 minutes, the emergency response proceeded according to 4 decades of training and procedure development. Then the tsunami arrived. When seawater overwhelmed the emergency diesel generators at 1527, operators faced a condition that existed at the margins of design consideration: station blackout. No electrical power meant no pumps, no instrumentation, no active cooling. The reactor's residual heat, still generating megawatts of thermal energy, could only be removed through passive systems never intended for extended operation. The Mark I containment design represented a fundamental philosophy shaped by economic optimization and 1960s assumptions about external threats. General Electric's boiling water reactor concept, licensed and constructed in Japan beginning in the late 1960s, embodied a design trade-off that would prove fatal under conditions the designers deemed incredible. The compact, pressure-suppression containment was engineered for efficiency, smaller than pressurized water reactor containments, less expensive to build, optimized for the anticipated spectrum of internal failures. The design assumed that alternating current power would be available, if not continuously, then at least within hours of any conceivable emergency. This assumption permeated every aspect of the safety philosophy. The emergency core cooling system relied on electric pumps. The containment cooling system required electric fans. The isolation condenser at Unit 1 needed electric power to operate its valves in the long term. Even the instrumentation that operators depended on to understand reactor conditions drew power from the electrical grid. Most critically, the design basis tsunami height of 5.7 meters, based on historical records, and the judgment of the Japan Society of Civil Engineers as revised in 2002, reflected an engineering culture that valued quantifiable precedent over uncertain possibility. The reactor's safety systems performed precisely as intended for the first phase of the emergency. Automatic scram occurred within seconds of the seismic trigger. shutting down nuclear fission. The reactor protection system functioned flawlessly. Emergency diesel generators started automatically when external power was lost due to earthquake damage to transmission infrastructure. Unit 1 Foot's isolation condenser began operating, removing decay heat by condensing reactor steam through natural circulation and venting it to atmosphere, a passive system that required no electrical power for basic operation. But the isolation condenser operated within limits that reflected the same assumptions embedded throughout the design. Its control valves, while manually operable, were designed for short-term service during anticipated transients. The operators, trained on procedures that assumed rapid restoration of normal power, manually closed the isolation condenser approximately 19 minutes after the earthquake to comply with cool-down rate restrictions, a standard practice based on the reasonable expectation that other cooling systems would soon be available. Station blackout as a design condition had been considered during the reactor's licensing, but as a brief interruption, not a sustained state. The Regulatory Guide for Reviewing Safety Design of Light Water Nuclear Power Plants, established in 1977, required nuclear facilities to ensure the safe shutdown and subsequent cooling of reactors in the event of a short-term station blackout, at least 30 minutes. This guideline reflected the prevailing wisdom that Japan's reliable electrical grid and robust emergency power systems made extended blackouts extremely unlikely. The assumption proved false not because it was unreasonable, but because it was incomplete. The designers and regulators had focused on the reliability of individual components rather than the vulnerability of their common support systems. Emergency diesel generators had excellent reliability records individually, but they shared a dependence on cooling water pumps, electrical distribution panels, and physical locations that could be simultaneously compromised by external events. When the tsunami arrived at 1527, it exploited this latent design vulnerability systematically. The wave height, measuring 14 to 15 meters above standard sea level, overwhelmed defensive barriers sized for the design basis threat. Seawater flooded the turbine building basement where the emergency diesel generators were located, not because the generators themselves were poorly designed, but because the comprehensive threat assessment had underestimated the correlation between seismic and flooding hazards. The emergency power systems failed not individually but collectively, a common cause failure that the multiple, independent design philosophy was intended to prevent. Unit 1 Foot's 2 emergency diesel generators stopped at 1537, Units 2 and 3 at 1541, and Unit 4 at 1538. The timing was nearly simultaneous because the failure mechanism, flooding of electrical equipment by tsunami water, affected all units equally. More fundamentally, the failure revealed a contradiction in the design logic itself. The station had been built to withstand the maximum credible earthquake and the maximum credible tsunami, but these had been analyzed as separate phenomena rather than correlated events. A magnitude 9 earthquake necessarily generated tsunami waves far exceeding those from smaller seismic events, but the design basis had not incorporated this physical relationship. The reactor water level indication system, crucial for operators to maintain core cooling, itself depended on the electrical power that the emergency had eliminated. Reference leg instruments became unreliable when containment temperatures rose above design limits during core damage progression. What operators saw on their instruments, reactor water level rising at 2.4 on March 11th, reflected instrument failure rather than actual plant conditions. The core was already uncovered, but the control room indications suggested adequate cooling. This instrumentation failure exemplified a deeper issue embedded in the design philosophy: the assumption that operators would have access to reliable plant status information during emergencies. The control room had been designed with extensive monitoring capabilities, but these capabilities assumed continued electrical power. When power was lost, operators were forced to make critical decisions with minimal information, using battery-powered instruments that provided incomplete or misleading data. The design had anticipated many failure modes, but it had not anticipated the failure of its own information systems. Procedures existed for responding to loss of coolant accidents, electrical faults, and equipment failures, but not for responding to these emergencies while simultaneously unable to verify whether the response was working. The reactor became, in effect, a black box generating unknown amounts of heat, while operators implemented cooling measures whose effectiveness could not be confirmed. By the early morning hours of March 12, approximately 10 hours after the tsunami, Unit 1 had already suffered substantial core damage. The reactor protection system had worked. The containment had initially held. The emergency procedures had been followed. Yet the reactor core was melting because the fundamental design assumption that electrical power for cooling systems would be available or quickly restored had been invalidated by conditions that the design process had deemed sufficiently improbable to ignore. The Mark Y containment, pressurized beyond design limits by steam and hydrogen generated from core damage, began leaking radioactive materials through its top flange at approximately 6 on March 12. The containment was performing exactly as designed under design conditions, but the accident had progressed beyond design conditions into a regime where containment integrity could not be maintained indefinitely. This progression from design compliance to design exceedance marked the transition from a manageable emergency to an uncontrolled release of radioactive materials. At each step, the systems had functioned as intended, but the intended function was insufficient to cope with the actual threat. The isolation condenser had provided cooling, but not enough. The containment had provided barrier protection, but not indefinitely. The emergency generators had provided power, but not after flooding disabled them. The fundamental vulnerability was not any single component failure, but the comprehensive failure of the design basis itself. The external threat had exceeded not just the design parameters, but the conceptual framework within which those parameters were established. Station blackout was not simply longer than anticipated, it was qualitatively different, involving the loss of entire categories of backup systems that were assumed to retain some level of functionality. This design vulnerability set the stage for every subsequent decision point in the accident progression. Once electrical power was lost and could not be rapidly restored, every emergency response became an improvisation, attempted using equipment and procedures that assumed capabilities no longer available. The operators were competent and the procedures were logical, but both operated from a foundation of assumptions that the tsunami had systematically destroyed. The reactor core would continue generating heat that could not be removed by systems that could not be powered, monitored by instruments that could not function reliably, according to procedures that could not be fully implemented. The emergency diesel generators that failed at Fukushima Daiichi were not defective equipment but victims of a design philosophy that had embedded organizational assumptions into physical infrastructure. The generators themselves, manufactured by reputable suppliers and maintained according to rigorous schedules, represented decades of refinement in emergency power technology. Their placement in the basement levels of the turbine buildings, however, reflected a decision-making process that had systematically undervalued certain categories of risk while overemphasizing others. The critical technical artifact that determined the accident's trajectory was not the generators but their location below the design basis flood level. This placement decision, made during the plant's construction in the 1960s, embodied a latent organizational failure that would remain dormant for 40 years. The generators were positioned at elevation levels between -1 meter and +4 meters above sea level, while the design basis tsunami height was established at 5.7 meters. Under normal engineering logic, this would suggest adequate protection. The flaw lay not in the arithmetic, but in the assumption that design basis conditions represented absolute limits rather than statistical estimates. The siting decisions reflected an organizational bias toward optimizing for routine operations rather than extreme contingencies. Placing emergency equipment in basements provided several advantages: easier maintenance access, reduced noise transmission to work areas, protection from weather, and structural isolation from seismic vibration through the building's foundation. These were rational engineering choices that improved plant operability and worker conditions during normal operations, which comprised 99.9% of the facility's operating life. The tsunami design basis itself had been established through a process that prioritized documented historical precedent over theoretical modeling. The Japan Society of Civil Engineers methodology, revised in 2002, relied heavily on historical tsunami records dating back several centuries. This approach provided quantitative confidence by anchoring estimates in observable data rather than computer simulations or theoretical maximum wave calculations. The resulting 5.7-meter design basis carried the credibility of empirical validation. However, the historical record upon which this analysis was based contained a fundamental sampling limitation. The available tsunami data represented perhaps 400 years of documented events along a coastline that had experienced major seismic activity on geological timescales of thousands of years. The methodology was statistically sound for the dataset examined, but the dataset itself was incomplete by orders of magnitude. The Jogan tsunami of 869 AD, which geological evidence suggested had generated waves similar to those that struck in 2011, lay outside the analytical framework not because it was unknown, but because it was classified as insufficiently documented for quantitative analysis. This classification reflected an organizational tendency to discount risks that could not be precisely quantified while accepting quantified risks whose precision might be illusory. The 5.7-meter design basis carried an aura of scientific certainty that the geological evidence for larger tsunamis could not match. Engineers and regulators found it easier to design for a specific, defensible number than for an uncertain but potentially larger threat. The maintenance and inspection culture at Fukushima Daiichi had evolved sophisticated procedures for managing known failure modes, while remaining poorly equipped to recognize emergent vulnerabilities. The emergency diesel generators underwent regular testing, fuel system maintenance, and performance monitoring that exceeded industry standards. The electrical distribution systems received meticulous attention. The seawater cooling pumps that supported the generators were inspected and exercised on rigorous schedules. Each individual component was maintained as if plant safety depended on its reliable operation, which it did. Yet this component-focused maintenance philosophy inadvertently obscured system-level vulnerabilities. The maintenance records for emergency generators documented excellent reliability statistics, but these statistics assumed that the electrical distribution panels, cooling water systems, and physical structures supporting the generators would remain functional during emergencies. No maintenance protocol existed for verifying the continued validity of these assumptions because they were regarded as design givens rather than potential failure modes. The alarm and indication systems in the Unit 1 control room reflected similar organizational biases in their design priorities. The control room had been configured to provide operators with comprehensive information about normal plant operations and anticipated abnormal events. Hundreds of analog indicators, digital displays, and alarm lights conveyed detailed status information about reactor parameters, coolant temperatures, pump operations, and electrical system status. This instrumentation philosophy emphasized giving operators maximum information for managing complex but understood situations. The instrumentation design reflected an implicit assumption about the nature of emergencies that operators would face. Emergency procedures had been developed for loss of coolant accidents, electrical system failures, equipment malfunctions, and operator errors, but these scenarios all assumed that the basic information infrastructure would remain functional. Operators would have access to reactor pressure, water level, containment pressure, and radiation readings that would enable them to diagnose plant conditions and verify the effectiveness of their responses. Station blackout invalidated this instrumentation philosophy by eliminating the electrical power on which most monitoring systems depended. Battery-powered instruments provided limited information for limited time periods, but the comprehensive plant status awareness that procedures assumed was simply unavailable. Operators found themselves implementing emergency cooling measures while unable to verify whether cooling was actually occurring. The training programs for reactor operators had been structured around scenario-based exercises that emphasized rapid diagnosis and procedural compliance. Simulator training exposed operators to a wide variety of equipment failures, system malfunctions, and emergency conditions, building competence in recognizing abnormal situations and implementing appropriate responses. This training approach had proven effective for developing operator expertise in managing the types of emergencies that had been anticipated by the design process. However, the training scenarios shared a common assumption with the design philosophy that operators would retain access to the instrumentation and control systems needed to implement emergency procedures effectively. Training exercises for station blackout conditions focused on the brief power outages that the design basis envisioned, during which operators would manage the transition to emergency power and verify that backup systems were functioning as intended. Extended station blackout, lasting hours rather than minutes, had not been incorporated into the training curriculum because it had not been incorporated into the design basis. Operators had not practiced managing reactor cooling while simultaneously coping with instrument failures, communication system outages, and the complete loss of electrical power for pumps, fans, and control systems. The accident would require them to improvise cooling strategies using equipment and techniques that had never been integrated into their formal preparation. The emergency planning framework surrounding Fukushima Daiichi had been developed with careful attention to radiological protection procedures, evacuation planning, and public notification protocols. These plans reflected lessons learned from international incidents and incorporated best practices for managing the public safety consequences of nuclear emergencies. The planning process had involved multiple government agencies, local authorities, and nuclear industry organizations working to ensure coordinated and effective emergency response. The emergency plans, however, were predicated on the assumption that plant operators would maintain some level of control over the accident progression and that radiological releases, if they occurred, would follow patterns that could be predicted and managed through predetermined response measures. The plans assumed that operators would have reliable communication with off-site emergency response organizations and that plant status information would be available to support informed decision-making about protective actions for the surrounding population. Station blackout severed many of these assumed communications links and eliminated much of the plant status information that emergency plans expected to be available. Off-site emergency responders found themselves making critical decisions about evacuation and sheltering based on incomplete or outdated information about plant conditions. The emergency response became reactive rather than predictive, responding to events that had already occurred rather than preventing consequences that could be foreseen. The regulatory oversight framework that governed Fukushima Daiichi operations reflected an organizational confidence in deterministic safety analysis that would prove insufficient for the actual accident conditions. Regulatory reviews focused extensively on demonstrating that plant design and operating procedures could cope with specific, well-defined accident scenarios. This approach had the advantage of providing clear, measurable safety criteria that could be verified through engineering analysis and regulatory inspection. The regulatory process, however, shared the same limitation as the design process. It was optimized for evaluating known risks rather than discovering unknown vulnerabilities. Regulatory attention focused on ensuring compliance with established safety requirements rather than questioning whether those requirements adequately addressed the full spectrum of possible threats. The assumption that design basis conditions represented adequate protection was embedded in the regulatory framework itself. When Tokyo Electric Power Company had submitted seismic safety evaluations in March 2009, these reports had acknowledged the possibility of tsunamis larger than the design basis, but classified such events as research topics rather than immediate safety concerns. The regulatory review process accepted this classification, treating beyond design basis tsunamis as interesting theoretical possibilities, rather than credible threats requiring immediate protective measures. This regulatory approach reflected broader organizational tendencies to defer difficult decisions about uncertain risks, while focusing resources on managing well-understood problems. Regulators, like plant designers and operators, found it easier to ensure compliance with specific quantitative requirements than to grapple with open-ended questions about potentially larger but poorly characterized threats. The latent conditions that enabled the Fukushima accident were not the result of negligence or incompetence, but of systematic organizational biases that influenced decision-making at every level, from initial design through day-to-day operations. The physical vulnerabilities in emergency power placement, tsunami protection, and cooling system design reflected deeper patterns of risk assessment that prioritized quantifiable, manageable threats while discounting uncertain but potentially larger dangers. These organizational patterns would prove decisive when the tsunami arrived, transforming latent vulnerabilities into active failures and forcing operators to manage an emergency that exceeded not only their plant's design capabilities, but their conceptual framework for understanding nuclear safety itself. The seismic monitoring systems at Fukushima Daiichi detected the first pressure waves from the magnitude 9 earthquake at exactly 14:46:18 on March 11, 2011. Within seconds, automatic protective systems initiated reactor scram sequences at units 1, 2, and 3, which were operating at full power. Control rod insertion proceeded normally, with all rods fully inserted within the design time limits. Reactor power levels dropped to decay heat levels as nuclear fission ceased. For the first critical minutes, every automatic safety system functioned precisely as designed. The reactor protection systems had been engineered to respond to multiple types of seismic signals, and the March 11 earthquake provided an unambiguous trigger. Accelerometers mounted throughout the plant detected ground motion exceeding predetermined set points, automatically initiating protective actions without operator intervention. The scram logic functioned flawlessly, demonstrating that 4 decades of seismic engineering had successfully protected the plant against the primary initiating threat. External electrical power was lost at 14:47 due to earthquake damage to transmission lines and switchyard equipment. This power loss, while significant, fell within the envelope of anticipated responses to major seismic events. The plant's electrical systems automatically transferred essential loads to emergency diesel generators, which started successfully at 14:47 for Units 1 and 2, and 14:48 for Unit 3. Emergency core cooling systems activated as designed, with high-pressure coolant injection systems providing water to the reactor cores and residual heat removal systems maintaining cooling flow. The initial plant response validated decades of seismic safety analysis and emergency procedure development. Operators in the main control rooms observed plant parameters that matched expected values for a seismic scram event. Reactor pressures stabilized at normal post-shutdown levels. Emergency cooling flows were established and maintained. Containment systems remained intact and functional. Based on 40 years of operating experience and extensive emergency planning, this represented a successful response to a significant but manageable external event. Unit 1 foot's isolation condenser began operating automatically when reactor pressure reached 7.1 MPa, condensing reactor steam through heat exchange with water in an external pool and returning condensed water to the reactor vessel. This passive cooling system required no electrical power for its basic function, relying instead on natural circulation driven by density differences between hot and cold water. The system operated exactly as designed, removing decay heat at rates that initially exceeded procedural limits for reactor cooldown. Approximately 19 minutes after the earthquake, operators manually closed the isolation condenser outlet valve to reduce the cooling rate in compliance with technical specifications that limited reactor temperature decrease to 55 degrees Celsius per hour. This action reflected appropriate adherence to established procedures and demonstrated that operators retained control over plant systems during the early phase of the emergency. The manual operation was based on the reasonable expectation that other cooling systems would be available to resume heat removal at acceptable rates. At 15:27, 41 minutes after the earthquake, the tsunami arrived at Fukushima Daiichi. Wave heights measured 14 to 15 meters above sea level, as the water overwhelmed the plant's 5.7-meter design basis protection and flooded areas containing critical safety equipment. The timing of the tsunami arrival had been predicted by operators based on seismological analysis, but the magnitude of the flooding exceeded all design assumptions and emergency planning scenarios. The tsunami water entered the plant through multiple pathways that had not been anticipated in the flooding analysis. Large component access doors in the turbine buildings, designed to accommodate equipment delivery during construction and maintenance, provided direct entry routes for seawater to reach basement-level emergency equipment, underground trenches and cable routes, intended to protect electrical systems from external weather, became conduits for floodwater to reach electrical distribution panels and emergency generator support systems. Emergency diesel generators began failing within minutes of tsunami arrival. Unit 1 Foots generators stopped at 15:37, 10 minutes after the tsunami struck. Units 2 and 3 lost their generators at 15:41, followed by Unit 4 at 15:38. The failure mechanism was consistent across all units: seawater infiltration of electrical equipment that disabled generator operation either directly through electrical shorts or indirectly through loss of essential support systems such as cooling water pumps and electrical distribution panels. The transition from design basis emergency to beyond design basis accident occurred with remarkable speed and comprehensiveness. Within 14 minutes of tsunami arrival, Fukushima Daiichi had lost all AC electrical power at Units 1, 2, and 3, transitioning from a manageable emergency to a condition that existed at the margins of emergency planning and operator training. The plant safety systems had been reduced to battery-powered instrumentation and passive cooling systems that were never intended for extended operation. Station blackout created an immediate information crisis in the control rooms. Most plant monitoring systems required AC power to operate, leaving operators with limited and rapidly degrading visibility into actual plant conditions. Battery-powered instruments provided some parameter readings, but many critical measurements became unavailable or unreliable, as electrical systems failed and backup power sources were exhausted. Operators found themselves managing a nuclear emergency while effectively flying blind. The loss of communication systems compounded the information crisis by severing links between control room operators, plant management, and off-site emergency response organizations. Internal plant communications that relied on electrical power became inoperative. External telephone and data connections were disrupted by combined earthquake and tsunami damage to telecommunications infrastructure. Emergency responders at local and national levels began making critical decisions about public protective actions based on incomplete and rapidly obsoleting information about plant status. Unit 1 Foots reactor water level indication, crucial for assessing core cooling adequacy, became progressively unreliable as plant conditions deteriorated. The level measurement system depended on differential pressure readings between the reactor vessel and a reference leg containing water outside the vessel. As containment temperatures rose due to loss of cooling, water in the reference leg began evaporating, causing indicated water level readings to diverge from actual conditions within the reactor vessel. By approximately 18 on March 11th, actual reactor water level at Unit 1 had dropped below the top of the fuel assemblies, beginning a process of core uncovery that would lead to fuel damage within hours. However, control room indications suggested that water level remained adequate for core cooling. This divergence between actual plant conditions and indicated conditions created a false sense of plant status that would influence operator decision-making throughout the early phases of the accident. The isolation condenser at Unit 1, operators' primary tool for removing decay heat during station blackout, had been manually isolated earlier in the event and could not be easily reopened without electrical power to operate its control valves. Attempts to manually operate the system were hampered by high radiation levels in areas where manual valve operation would be required and by uncertainty about the system's actual operational status. Operators had lost the ability to verify whether their actions were having the intended effect on reactor conditions. Reactor pressure at Unit 1 remained elevated at approximately 7 MPa due to continued steam generation from decay heat, while core cooling was inadequate to remove the heat being generated. This combination of high pressure and inadequate cooling created conditions for rapid fuel temperature escalation once water level dropped below the fuel assembly tops. The reactor protection systems had successfully shut down nuclear fission, but the remaining decay heat, still several % of full reactor power, required active cooling that was no longer available. The first indication of significant core damage appeared at approximately 21:51 on March 11th, when radiation levels in the Unit 1 reactor building rose substantially above normal values. This increase suggested that radioactive materials from damaged fuel assemblies were being released from the reactor vessel into the containment atmosphere. However, operators lacked the instrumentation and communication systems needed to confirm the extent of core damage or predict its progression. Containment pressure at Unit 1 began rising above normal values during the evening of March 11, reaching 600 kPa by approximately 2350, twice the containment design pressure of 300 kPa. This pressure increase indicated that steam and possibly hydrogen gas from fuel damage were accumulating within the containment volume at rates that exceeded the containment's capacity to absorb or condense the gases. The containment was performing its designed function of retaining radioactive materials, but at pressure levels that could not be sustained indefinitely. The progression from successful emergency response to uncontrolled core damage occurred over a period of approximately 6 hours, during which operators implemented every available emergency cooling measure but lacked the electrical power needed to make those measures effective. Fire protection systems were activated to provide alternative cooling water, but reactor pressure remained too high to allow low-pressure injection systems to deliver water to the reactor vessel. Manual depressurization required electrical power to operate relief valves, power that was no longer available. By midnight on March 11th, approximately 10 hours after the initial earthquake, Fukushima Daiichi Unit 1 had transitioned from a design basis emergency that was being successfully managed to a beyond design basis accident involving active core damage and containment pressurization. The physical systems continued to operate according to design. Containment structures retained radioactive materials. Passive cooling systems removed some decay heat. Control room operators followed established procedures, but the integrated plant response was insufficient to prevent core damage under station blackout conditions. The divergence between expected plant behavior and actual plant behavior had become systematic rather than partial. Operators expected that emergency cooling systems would maintain core cooling, but electrical power to operate those systems was unavailable. They expected that instrumentation would provide reliable information about plant status, but power outages and high radiation fields made most measurements unreliable. They expected that emergency procedures would provide effective guidance for managing plant conditions, but the procedures assumed capabilities that station blackout had eliminated. Fundamentally, operators expected that core damage could be prevented through proper emergency response, but the combination of station blackout and design basis tsunami exceedance had created conditions where core damage was inevitable regardless of operator actions. The plant had entered a regime where physics rather than procedures would determine the accident progression, and where operator responses could influence the timing and magnitude of consequences, but could not prevent those consequences entirely. The transition from successful reactor scram to irreversible core damage at Fukushima Daiichi Unit 1 occurred through a precisely choreographed sequence of thermal hydraulic phenomena that operators could neither observe nor control. The physics of decay heat generation, boiling water reactor thermal hydraulics, and nuclear fuel behavior created a deterministic progression from station blackout to fuel assembly degradation that proceeded according to fundamental physical laws rather than emergency procedures or operator intentions. Decay heat generation in the reactor core following shutdown represented approximately 7% of full reactor power initially, declining exponentially but remaining substantial for days after reactor scram. For Unit 1, operating at 460 megawatts thermal at the time of shutdown, decay heat generation was approximately 30 megawatts immediately after scram, decreasing to roughly 20 megawatts after 1 hour and 15 megawatts after 6 hours. This heat generation, while much lower than full power operation, still required continuous cooling to prevent fuel temperature escalation beyond design limits. The isolation condenser system at Unit 1, designed to remove decay heat through passive natural circulation, had a heat removal capacity of approximately 8 to 10 megawatts under optimal operating conditions. This capacity was theoretically sufficient to balance decay heat generation, but only if the system operated continuously with adequate water inventory in both the reactor vessel and the isolation condenser condensate pool. When operators manually closed the isolation condenser outlet valve at approximately 1505 to comply with cool-down rate restrictions. They interrupted this heat removal path during the critical period when tsunami-induced station blackout eliminated all other cooling options. The reactor water inventory at Unit 1 contained approximately 70 cubic meters of water above the fuel assembly tops under normal operating conditions. Following loss of all active cooling systems, this water inventory began boiling at rates determined by decay heat generation and pressure conditions within the reactor vessel. At 7 MPa reactor pressure and temperatures corresponding to saturation conditions, the boil-off rate was approximately 0.3 cubic meters per minute initially, increasing as reactor pressure decreased through steam release via safety relief valves. Steam generated by core boiling was released to the suppression pool through safety relief valve operations that occurred automatically when reactor pressure exceeded set points. Each relief valve cycling transferred thermal energy from the reactor vessel to the suppression pool, but also removed water inventory that could not be replaced due to loss of injection systems. The net effect was progressive core uncovery as water level dropped below the fuel assembly tops, exposing increasingly larger portions of the nuclear fuel to steam environment rather than water cooling. Core uncovery at Unit 1 began approximately 4 hours after tsunami arrival, when reactor water level dropped below the top of active fuel at elevation plus 4 meters relative to the reactor vessel bottom. Once exposed to steam rather than liquid water, fuel assembly temperatures began rising rapidly due to the poor heat transfer characteristics of steam compared to liquid water cooling. Zircaloy fuel cladding temperatures, normally maintained below 300 degrees Celsius during operation, began approaching 1,000 degrees Celsius within 1 hour of initial uncovery. The zirconium-water reaction became significant when fuel cladding temperatures exceeded approximately 1,200 degrees Celsius, generating hydrogen gas through the exothermic oxidation of zirconium metal according to the reaction Zr plus 2H2O, ZrO2 plus 2H2 plus heat. This reaction was autocatalytic, meaning that the heat generated by oxidation accelerated the reaction rate, causing cladding temperatures to rise even more rapidly. Substantial hydrogen generation began at Unit 1 by approximately 19 on March 11, roughly 4 hours after core uncovery commenced. Fuel pellet temperatures within the zircaloy cladding rose even more rapidly than cladding surface temperatures due to the thermal resistance of the oxidized cladding layer. When fuel centerline temperatures exceeded approximately 2,800 degrees Celsius, uranium dioxide fuel pellets began melting, creating a mixture of molten uranium dioxide, zirconium, and steel from control rod materials. This molten mixture, termed corium, represented the complete breakdown of the engineered barriers designed to retain radioactive fission products within the fuel matrix. The progression from initial core uncovery to significant fuel melting occurred over approximately 6 hours, driven by the relentless continuation of decay heat generation in an environment where heat removal had become inadequate. No amount of procedural compliance or operator skill could alter this physical progression once the thermal hydraulic conditions were established. The reactor core became a heat source that exceeded the available heat removal capacity, making fuel damage inevitable regardless of subsequent actions. Containment pressure and temperature began rising substantially during the evening of March 11th as steam and hydrogen generated by core damage accumulated within the primary containment volume. The Mark I containment at Unit 1, designed for a maximum pressure of 300 kPa, experienced pressure increases to approximately 750 kPa by 3 on March 12, 2.5 times the design pressure. This pressurization occurred despite the containment's pressure suppression system, which was designed to condense steam by directing it through pipes submerged in the suppression pool. The containment pressure increase indicated that steam generation rates from core damage exceeded the condensation capacity of the suppression pool, whose effectiveness declined as pool temperature approached saturation conditions. Additionally, hydrogen gas generated by zirconium-water reactions could not be condensed by the pressure suppression system, contributing to containment pressurization, without providing a means for pressure relief through the designed condensation mechanisms. Fission product release from the damaged fuel assemblies began when fuel cladding integrity was lost through oxidation and melting. volatile fission products, particularly radioactive isotopes of iodine and cesium, were released from the fuel matrix and transported by steam flow into the containment atmosphere. These materials, which had been retained within the fuel pellets during normal operation, became airborne contaminants that increased radiation levels throughout the primary containment and eventually leaked to the reactor building atmosphere. The containment leakage pathway became active when containment pressure exceeded the structural capacity of containment penetrations and seals to maintain perfect integrity. The top flange of the containment vessel, designed to be removable for refueling operations, began leaking radioactive gases when differential pressure exceeded the sealing capability of the gasket system. This leakage pathway, while small in volumetric terms, provided direct transport of radioactive materials from the primary containment to the reactor building atmosphere. Hydrogen accumulation in the reactor building occurred as hydrogen-laden gas leaked from the containment through the top flange pathway. The reactor building, designed as a secondary containment structure but not engineered to prevent hydrogen accumulation, provided a large volume where hydrogen gas could mix with air and accumulate to concentrations approaching flammability limits. The building's ventilation systems, dependent on electrical power that had been lost during station blackout, could not remove hydrogen gas as it accumulated. The reactor water level indication system provided misleading information throughout the core damage progression due to reference leg flashing caused by high containment temperatures. As containment atmosphere temperature rose above 100 degrees Celsius due to steam and energy released from core damage, water in the instrument reference legs began boiling, creating vapor bubbles that caused indicated water level to appear higher than actual water level within the reactor vessel. This instrumentation failure meant that operators received progressively less reliable information about core cooling adequacy, precisely when such information was most critical. By the morning of March 12, approximately 18 hours after the earthquake, Unit 1 had experienced substantial core melting with corium formation in the lower regions of the reactor vessel. The reactor pressure vessel, designed to contain nuclear fuel under all design basis conditions, was experiencing thermal and chemical attack from molten core materials at temperatures approaching 3,000 degrees Celsius. While the vessel retained gross structural integrity, the combination of thermal stress, chemical corrosion, and internal pressure created conditions for potential vessel failure that had never been analyzed during the plant's design process. The failure progression from station blackout to core melting demonstrated the inadequacy of design basis safety analysis for beyond design basis conditions. Each individual system, reactor protection, emergency cooling, containment isolation, pressure suppression, performed according to design specifications under the conditions for which it had been designed. However, station blackout created conditions that exceeded design specifications for multiple systems simultaneously, leading to failure modes that had not been anticipated or analyzed. Most critically, the failure progression was largely independent of operator actions once station blackout persisted beyond the first few hours. Operators could influence the timing of specific events through manual valve operations and system alignments, but they could not prevent the fundamental thermal hydraulic progression that led from inadequate core cooling to fuel damage. The physics of decay heat generation, boiling heat transfer, and zirconium oxidation proceeded according to natural laws that emergency procedures could not suspend or modify. The containment system, designed as the final barrier against fission product release, was overwhelmed not by a single large breach, but by the cumulative effect of conditions that exceeded design assumptions. Containment pressure exceeded design limits, containment temperature exceeded design limits, and containment atmosphere composition, with substantial hydrogen concentrations, exceeded design assumptions. The containment continued to provide some level of fission product retention, but at effectiveness levels that decreased as conditions diverged further from design specifications. By 6% on March 12, when containment pressure began decreasing from its peak of 750 kPa, significant fission product leakage to the environment had commenced through containment leakage pathways that opened when structural limits were exceeded. This pressure decrease coincided with increased radiation measurements at site boundaries, confirming that radioactive materials generated by core damage were reaching the environment despite the presence of engineered containment barriers. The physical evidence of hydrogen generation, fission product release, and containment pressurization demonstrated that Unit 1 had experienced core damage substantially more severe than any accident analyzed during the plant's licensing process. The accident had progressed beyond design basis conditions into a realm where component performance could no longer be predicted from design specifications and where accident consequences were determined by fundamental physical and chemical processes rather than engineered safety systems. The recognition that conventional emergency response measures had failed at Fukushima Daiichi Unit 1 prompted a transition from procedural compliance to improvised accident management that would define the remainder of the accident progression. By the early morning hours of March 12, plant management and emergency response teams acknowledged that they faced conditions beyond the scope of established emergency procedures and began implementing measures that had never been tested under actual plant conditions or integrated into formal training programs. The containment venting system, originally designed as a severe accident mitigation measure but never intended for use during simultaneous station blackout, became the primary tool for preventing catastrophic containment failure that could release vastly larger quantities of radioactive material than controlled venting. The venting system at Unit 1 consisted of a hardened wet well vent line designed to release containment atmosphere through the suppression pool, where scrubbing action would remove substantial quantities of dissolved and particulate radioactive materials before release to the environment. At 0:06 on March 12, plant management received authorization to prepare for containment venting when containment pressure measurements confirmed that structural integrity could not be maintained indefinitely at pressure levels approaching 3 times design specifications. The venting preparation order represented an explicit acknowledgement that the containment system, the final engineered barrier against large-scale fission product release, would be deliberately breached to prevent an even larger uncontrolled release through structural failure. The venting operation itself required electrical power to operate isolation valves in the vent line, power that station blackout had eliminated. Manual valve operation became necessary, requiring workers to enter high radiation environments within the reactor building while carrying portable tools and air supplies needed to operate valves designed for remote operation. The complexity of manual operations under emergency conditions meant that venting could not be implemented rapidly, even after the decision to vent had been made. Attempts to operate the containment vent manually were initiated at approximately 9 on March 12, when workers entered the reactor building carrying portable air compressors and hand tools needed to open pneumatically operated valves. However, radiation levels within the building had risen substantially above normal values due to fission product leakage from the containment, limiting worker access time and requiring multiple entries to complete valve lineups that would normally be accomplished from the control room in minutes. The manual venting operation required opening both an electric motor-operated valve and a pneumatic valve connected in series in the vent line. The electric valve was positioned manually to approximately 25% open at 9:15, but the pneumatic valve could not be fully opened due to insufficient compressed air pressure in systems that depended on AC power for compressor operation. This partial valve alignment provided some reduction in containment pressure but far less than the full flow capacity needed for effective pressure control. At 10:17 on March 12, operators attempted to complete the venting operation by using residual air pressure in the instrument air system, opening valves momentarily when temporary pressure was available, but losing valve position when pressure decreased. This intermittent operation provided some containment pressure relief, but created uncertainty about the actual vent flow rates and the effectiveness of suppression pool scrubbing during periods of variable flow conditions. Containment pressure began decreasing at approximately 14:30 on March 12, suggesting that the venting operation had achieved some level of success in providing a controlled release path for containment atmosphere. However, the pressure reduction was accompanied by a sharp increase in radiation levels at the plant site boundary, confirming that radioactive materials were being released to the environment through the vent system despite the scrubbing action of the suppression pool. The alternative water injection system using fire protection equipment represented the only remaining option for providing core cooling when conventional emergency core cooling systems remained inoperable due to station blackout. Fire protection pumps, designed for much lower pressure operation than reactor systems, could not inject water directly into the reactor vessel, while reactor pressure remained at 7 MPa. Reactor depressurization became necessary to enable low-pressure water injection, but depressurization required operating relief valves that depended on electrical power and compressed air systems compromised by station blackout. Manual reactor depressurization was accomplished at approximately 9 on March 12 by using battery power to energize solenoid valves controlling safety relief valve operation. This required plant workers to carry automotive batteries from the plant parking area into the reactor building and connect them directly to valve control circuits using improvised wiring connections. The battery-powered valve operation successfully reduced reactor pressure from 7 MPa to approximately 0.8 MPa, enabling fire protection pumps to begin injecting water into the reactor vessel. Fresh water injection through the fire protection system began at 5:46 on March 12, using water from the plant's fire protection tank and delivering it through fire hose connections to the reactor core spray system. The injection rate was limited by the capacity of diesel-driven fire pumps to approximately 80 cubic meters per hour, substantially lower than design-basis emergency core cooling flow rates, but representing the only available means of providing water to the reactor core. The fresh water supply from the fire protection tank was exhausted by approximately 14:53 on March 12, after delivering roughly 80 cubic meters of water to the reactor vessel. This volume was insufficient to refill the reactor and re-establish water level above the fuel assemblies, particularly given continued steam generation from decay heat and the unknown extent of core damage that might have created flow paths for injected water to bypass the fuel assemblies entirely. Seawater injection became the only remaining option for continuing core cooling when fresh water supplies were exhausted. The transition to seawater injection represented crossing a threshold that had never been contemplated. During reactor design, deliberately introducing seawater with its corrosive chloride content into reactor systems designed for ultra-pure water chemistry. The decision to inject seawater acknowledged that reactor components might be permanently damaged, but that preventing further core damage took precedence over preserving equipment. Seawater injection preparation required extending fire hoses from the reactor building to the ocean, a distance of several hundred meters across terrain littered with tsunami debris and contaminated with radioactive material from containment venting and building leakage. Plant workers accomplished this task while wearing respiratory protection and radiation monitoring equipment, working in shifts to limit individual radiation exposure while maintaining continuous progress toward establishing seawater injection capability. The seawater injection system began operation at 2020 on March 12, approximately 6 hours after fresh water injection was terminated and 18 hours after core damage had begun. The seawater was drawn directly from the ocean using portable pumps and delivered through the same fire protection system piping that had been used for freshwater injection. Boric acid was added to the seawater to provide additional reactivity control, ensuring that any fuel assemblies that remained structurally intact would not achieve criticality even if optimal geometry and moderation conditions were restored. Hydrogen gas generated by zirconium-water reactions during core damage had been accumulating in the reactor building atmosphere throughout the period when core damage was occurring. The reactor building, designed as a secondary containment structure, was not equipped with hydrogen removal systems or hydrogen monitoring equipment because hydrogen accumulation within the building had not been considered a credible scenario during design basis accident analysis. The hydrogen explosion at Unit 1 occurred at 15:36 on March 12. Approximately 1 hour after successful containment venting had indicated that accident mitigation measures were achieving their intended effects. The explosion destroyed the upper portion of the reactor building, creating a massive cloud of debris and confirming that hydrogen concentrations had reached flammability limits despite the building's large volume and natural air exchange. The timing of the hydrogen explosion relative to the start of seawater injection was particularly significant because it occurred just as operators had established the first effective core cooling method since station blackout began. The explosion did not directly damage the reactor vessel or primary containment, but it destroyed much of the equipment and infrastructure needed for continued accident response, including electrical cables, air compressors, and communication systems that had been restored through emergency repair efforts. Post-explosion damage assessment revealed that the reactor building structure remained adequate to protect the primary containment and reactor vessel from external weather, but that many of the systems needed for continued emergency response had been compromised. Fire protection pumps continued operating, maintaining seawater injection to the reactor core, but the loss of building infrastructure complicated efforts to monitor plant parameters and implement additional accident mitigation measures. The explosion also dramatically increased radiation levels in areas surrounding the reactor building, further limiting worker access for manual operations and equipment repair. Combined with the radiological consequences of containment venting, the explosion created a work environment where even essential emergency tasks required extensive planning to limit worker radiation exposure, while maintaining continuous accident response efforts. The fundamental challenge facing accident response efforts after March 12 was that conventional measures for terminating nuclear emergencies, restoring electrical power, re-establishing normal cooling systems, and verifying that reactor conditions had returned to safe shutdown states, were no longer possible given the extent of core damage and infrastructure destruction. Operators could maintain cooling water injection and monitor gross plant parameters, but they could not confirm that the reactor core remained intact or that continued cooling would be sufficient to prevent further degradation. Seawater injection continued at rates of approximately 120 cubic meters per hour, substantially higher than the boil-off rate from decay heat generation, suggesting that some level of core cooling was being maintained. However, reactor vessel instrumentation had been compromised by core damage and high radiation fields, making it impossible to verify water level, core geometry, or the distribution of cooling flow within the reactor vessel. The cooling process had become empirical rather than analytical, based on maintaining injection rates thought to be adequate rather than confirmed through instrument readings. The transition from emergency response to long-term accident management occurred gradually as it became clear that the reactor could be maintained in a quasi-stable state through continued seawater injection, but could not be restored to normal shutdown conditions using available systems and methods. The accident had created a new operational regime where the reactor was neither operating normally nor completely destroyed, but required indefinite continuation of improvised cooling measures to prevent further degradation. This indefinite operational state represented a fundamental challenge to emergency planning and accident management frameworks that assumed nuclear emergencies would either be successfully terminated through procedural responses or would progress rapidly to off-site consequences that triggered predetermined emergency response measures. The Fukushima accident had evolved into a prolonged crisis requiring sustained resource commitment without clear endpoints or success criteria for terminating emergency operations. The forensic investigation of Fukushima Daiichi Unit 1 began years before physical access to the reactor vessel became possible, relying initially on indirect measurements, computer modeling, and analysis of plant parameters recorded during the accident progression. The challenge of understanding what had actually occurred within the reactor core was complicated by the same factors that had prevented operators from managing the accident effectively: high radiation fields, structural damage, and the inaccessibility of key plant areas due to contamination and debris. Remote sensing technologies provided the first definitive evidence of the extent of core damage. Muon tomography, a technique borrowed from high-energy physics research, used cosmic ray muons to penetrate the reactor vessel and containment structures, creating images based on the density of materials encountered. When applied to Unit 1 in 2015, muon tomography revealed that virtually no fuel assemblies remained in their original positions within the reactor vessel, confirming that core melting had been far more extensive than initial estimates had suggested. The muon tomography results showed that the majority of nuclear fuel had relocated to the bottom head of the reactor vessel, forming a debris bed of solidified corium, a mixture of melted uranium dioxide fuel, zirconium cladding, stainless steel control rod materials, and structural components. This debris bed, estimated to contain approximately 80% of the original core inventory, represented the physical confirmation that Unit 1 had experienced complete core meltdown, rather than the partial fuel damage that some early analyses had projected. Robotic inspections of the primary containment, conducted beginning in 2017 using specially designed radiation-hardened robots, provided direct visual evidence of the accident's progression and its consequences for reactor internals. The robots documented extensive damage to reactor vessel supports, melted and relocated structural materials, and the presence of fuel debris extending beyond the reactor vessel into the containment sump area. These observations confirmed that core melting had been severe enough to challenge reactor vessel integrity, and had resulted in corium relocation outside the engineered barriers designed to contain nuclear fuel. Water sampling and radiochemical analysis from the reactor vessel and containment provided additional forensic evidence about the timing and extent of fuel damage. Isotopic ratios of fission products dissolved in cooling water enabled reconstruction of when fuel cladding failure began, when fuel melting commenced, and when corium formation occurred. These analyses confirmed that significant fuel damage had begun within hours of station blackout and that complete core meltdown had occurred over the course of the first day following tsunami impact. The forensic reconstruction revealed that reactor vessel failure had occurred through bottom head penetration melting rather than gross structural failure. Molten corium, reaching temperatures above 2,000 degrees Celsius, had attacked control rod drive mechanism penetrations in the reactor vessel bottom head, creating flow paths for corium to relocate into the containment. This failure mode meant that the reactor vessel had maintained gross structural integrity while losing its function as a barrier against fission product release, a distinction that proved crucial for limiting the quantity of radioactive materials released to the environment. Analysis of hydrogen generation and transport provided insights into the mechanisms that led to the reactor building explosion on March 12. Gas sampling and computational fluid dynamics modeling revealed that hydrogen concentrations in the reactor building had reached 8 to 10% by volume before ignition occurred, well above the 4% concentration needed for deflagration in air. The hydrogen had accumulated over approximately 20 hours, through containment leakage pathways that had not been identified during design basis accident analysis. The hydrogen explosion investigation revealed a fundamental gap in severe accident analysis methodology: the failure to consider hydrogen transport and accumulation in secondary containment buildings during prolonged station blackout scenarios. The Mark I containment design included hydrogen recombiners within the primary containment to prevent hydrogen accumulation during design basis accidents. But these systems required electrical power that station blackout had eliminated. No provisions existed for managing hydrogen that leaked from containment into the reactor building through pathways that opened when containment pressure exceeded design limits. Environmental monitoring data collected during and after the accident provided evidence for the quantity and timing of radioactive material releases. Analysis of atmospheric dispersion patterns, ground contamination measurements, and atmospheric monitoring results enabled reconstruction of source terms and release rates that could be correlated with specific events during accident progression. These measurements confirmed that the largest radioactive material releases occurred during containment venting operations and following the hydrogen explosion, not during the initial core damage phase when containment integrity was maintained. The environmental measurements revealed that total radioactive cesium-137 release from Unit 1 was approximately 2 to 3 petabecquerels, roughly 10% of the inventory contained in the reactor core at the time of the accident. This release fraction, while representing the largest nuclear accident in Japan's history, was substantially lower than releases from accidents where containment systems were absent or failed catastrophically. The Mark I containment, despite being overwhelmed by beyond design basis conditions, had retained 90% of the radioactive inventory through continued structural integrity, even after pressure and temperature exceedances. Long-term monitoring of reactor conditions provided evidence about the effectiveness of continued water injection for maintaining quasi-stable conditions. Temperature measurements from thermocouples that survived the accident showed that reactor temperatures had stabilized at levels consistent with adequate cooling of relocated fuel debris. water injection rates were gradually reduced from emergency levels of 120 cubic meters per hour to sustainable rates of approximately 3 to 4 cubic meters per hour that balanced cooling requirements with minimizing contaminated water generation. The accident investigation identified specific regulatory and industry practices that had contributed to the accident's severity and suggested modifications needed to prevent similar events. The investigation revealed that periodic safety reviews had not adequately addressed external event scenarios or the potential for correlated failures affecting multiple safety systems simultaneously. Station blackout analysis had been limited to brief power outages rather than extended loss of both on-site and off-site power systems. Design modification requirements implemented in response to the accident included provisions for beyond design basis external events, diverse and hardened emergency power sources, and enhanced containment venting systems with improved filtering capabilities. These modifications acknowledge that design basis analysis methodology, while appropriate for most scenarios, was insufficient for preventing or mitigating consequences of extreme external events that could challenge multiple safety systems simultaneously. Emergency preparedness improvements included expanded evacuation planning zones, enhanced environmental monitoring capabilities, and improved communication systems designed to function during extended station blackout conditions. The accident had demonstrated that nuclear emergency response required capabilities that remained functional even when plant infrastructure was severely compromised and normal communication channels were unavailable. Operator training programs were modified to include extended station blackout scenarios and severe accident management procedures that had previously been considered beyond the scope of routine operator qualification. Simulator training began incorporating scenarios where normal instrumentation was unavailable and where operators were required to implement emergency cooling using improvised methods and equipment not normally associated with reactor operations. The regulatory framework was restructured to include beyond design basis events as requirements rather than voluntary guidelines, acknowledging that some external threats, while having low probability of occurrence, could have consequences severe enough to justify mandatory protective measures. This regulatory philosophy shift represented a transition from deterministic analysis, focused on design basis scenarios, to risk-informed regulation that considered low probability, high-consequence events in safety requirements. The Fukushima accident demonstrated that reactor safety depends not only on the reliability of individual components, but on the resilience of integrated systems under conditions that exceed design assumptions. The accident occurred not because safety systems failed to operate as designed, but because the accident conditions exceeded the envelope within which those systems had been designed to function effectively. This distinction proved crucial for understanding how similar accidents could be prevented and how existing reactor designs could be modified to provide adequate safety margins for beyond design basis conditions. The most significant systemic lesson from the forensic investigation was that nuclear safety requires explicit consideration of scenario uncertainty, the recognition that actual accident conditions might differ fundamentally from those analyzed during design and licensing processes. Emergency procedures, operator training, and safety system design needed to maintain effectiveness under conditions that could not be completely foreseen or analyzed in advance. The accident revealed that deterministic safety analysis, while necessary and valuable, was insufficient for addressing the full spectrum of potential threats to nuclear facilities. Probabilistic risk assessment methods needed to be integrated more comprehensively into design requirements, emergency planning, and regulatory oversight to ensure that low-probability, high-consequence events received adequate attention in safety programs. The forensic evidence ultimately confirmed that the Fukushima accident resulted from the systematic underestimation of external event threats and the systematic overestimation of safety system capabilities under beyond design basis conditions. The reactor systems had performed according to design specifications, but those specifications had proven inadequate for the actual challenge presented by correlated seismic and tsunami threats that exceeded historical precedent. Most fundamentally, the investigation revealed that reactor safety required active recognition of the limitations inherent in engineering design and analysis methods, rather than confidence that those methods could anticipate all credible threats. The accident progression had been determined by physics and engineering realities that proceeded independently of human intentions, procedures, or regulatory frameworks, demonstrating that nuclear safety ultimately depended on maintaining adequate margins between actual plant capabilities and the most severe threats that could reasonably be postulated. The systematic lessons from Fukushima thus pointed not toward specific technical fixes, but toward fundamental changes in how the nuclear industry approached uncertainty, analyzed external threats, and designed systems to maintain safety functions under conditions that could not be completely predicted or controlled. The accident had not failed because the wrong decisions were made, but because the decision-making framework itself was inadequate for the realities of nuclear technology, operating in a natural environment whose extremes could not be precisely bounded or permanently contained.